And I think it's vital to remember there's only room for one sovereign at a time, not two. So you can't be the same as the sovereign if you're the Prince of Wales or the heir.
Whispers turned into roars inside Buckingham Palace as King Charles made the unthinkable move, forcing Queen Camilla to step away from royal life amid shocking allegations of a secret bid for the throne behind closed doors. Court insiders spoke openly of palace warfare and a queen unwilling to wait her turn. In the shadows, Camilla was said to be quietly rallying loyalists, her influence stretching far beyond the gilded walls. One insider murmured, he underestimated her patience, and she underestimated his resolve. The nation was left wondering, has this royal battle truly ended, or is the most dangerous act still to come? The glittering grand hall gleamed under chandeliers, golden light bouncing across polished marble floors, crystal glasses and jewelled gowns. It was one of those evenings meant to be photographed, documented and broadcast as the perfect image of royal unity. King Charles stood beside Queen Camilla, posture impeccable, expression warm enough to fool any casual observer. Camilla, draped in a shimmering emerald gown, wore the kind of smile perfected through decades of public life. Elegant, poised, entirely rehearsed. Cameras clicked like a mechanical chorus, capturing a harmony that didn't exist behind the glimmering facade. Tension simmered like a storm just over the horizon, unseen but inevitable. Charles and Camilla appeared in sync, moving through the crowd, greeting dignitaries, laughing at polite jokes. Yet a closer eye would spot the fractures, tiny, almost invisible to those clinging to the fairy tale. Charles's gaze often drifted mid-conversation, lost in thought far from the glitter and noise. Camilla's laughter came a heartbeat late, her hand resting on his arm out of obligation rather than affection. A seasoned royal correspondent observing from the edge of the room would later remark that the scene felt brittle, like porcelain ready to shatter. Charles, beneath the veneer, felt the weight of something unspoken pressing on him. As the evening wore on, his gaze kept drifting toward the great arched windows, city lights twinkling against the night. He recalled the early days, when he believed the crown would bring family unity and marital peace. Now shadows darkened that vision, an ache he could neither ignore nor fully define. Camilla's presence was beside him, but the distance felt like a brick wall, carefully constructed over time. Months of polite smiles exchanged for appearances only highlighted the emptiness behind them. Camilla, ever aware, had mastered the art of serene illusion, but in fleeting glances, their eyes met, flashes of sharp, guarded intent breaking through. In this world, appearances were everything. A marriage could be fraying, yet a perfect smile, the right jewels, the right pose, made it seem flawless. Still, the strain seeped through. Her laughter rang too loud, fingers tightened subtly around her clutch, eyes darting to the press photographers to catch the perfect angle. To outsiders, it was elegance. To Charles, a performance. As music swelled and the crowd moved toward the ballroom for the evening toast, his private secretary leaned close, voice almost a whisper. If only the public knew what was really going on. The words were swallowed by laughter and clinking glasses, but hit Charles like a dart. He said nothing, only a faint nod, lips pressed thin. Dangerous thoughts lingered like smoke in his mind. In a far corner, a senior palace insider, decades of service behind him, watched silently. Later, off the record, he would sum it up chillingly. In this family, power is never simply given, it's taken. Those words would echo through the palace corridors in the weeks to come, a prophecy disguised as observation. For now, they hung unspoken, masked by the soft orchestral melodies and polite hum of small talk. The evening passed in a blur of formalities, speeches, toasts, and carefully staged photographs. To Charles, each moment felt heavy, weighted by invisible tension. When the last guest departed and the hall fell silent, he lingered, staring at the empty space once filled with glittering faces. Perfumes lingered, mingling with the faint tang of champagne. Somewhere in the palace, Camilla had retreated to her private rooms. For the first time that night, Charles allowed the mask to slip. Shoulders sagged, eyes dimmed. He felt it coming, and when it arrived, it would change everything. Whispers of a plot circulated. At night, the palace was a different world entirely. Grand corridors, busy by day, fell into hushed silence, broken only by distant clocks or echoing footsteps on marble. In these quiet hours, Queen Camilla held her most secretive meetings in lamplight, wine in hand, seated opposite a trusted confidant, curtains drawn tight, door guarded, no uninvited guests allowed, conversations low, punctuated with Camilla's sharp, knowing laugh. "He means well," she once murmured to a friend, "but meaning well is not the same as ruling." The words carried heavy weight. Those who heard them would never forget. Whispers soon spread through palace corridors. Staff moving between offices and private quarters overheard fragments they weren't meant to hear. A maid passing by the Queen's sitting room caught, "He is too soft for this role. Far too soft." Another time, a footman delivering a sealed envelope overheard, "If someone doesn't take charge, this whole thing will come apart." The palace had seen intrigue before, but this felt different. Sharper, deliberate, whispers spread like ink in water, seeping into every corner of the royal estate. Soon, everyone from junior valets to senior courtiers had heard some version of the rumour. The Queen was positioning herself for more than just influence. The outside world began sensing that something was off. Out of nowhere, newspapers began publishing curious stories, praising Camilla's decisiveness, vision, and leadership. Glowing profiles ran alongside articles painting King Charles as hesitant, indecisive, or overly sentimental. Headlines screamed, "A leader must have strength above all else," citing unnamed palace sources. Others hinted, "Camilla is ready to step in if necessary." The precision of the press coverage suggested someone inside the palace was feeding stories. In Charles's private study, stacks of clippings lay like accusations, staring back at him. He ran a hand over his face, sighing, asking aloud, "Why now? Why this?" A veteran courtier requested a private audience. Afternoon sunlight slanted through the tall windows. "Your Majesty," he said carefully. "She's building her own court inside the palace." Charles's brow furrowed, fingers tightening around the armrest. "What exactly do you mean?" The aide continued. "She's surrounding herself with people loyal to her first, the crown second, and you last." Even Camilla's closest allies noticed subtle shifts. At events, she moved with authority, greeting guests before Charles could. In meetings, she spoke boldly, sometimes cutting him off. "I'm only being practical," she would say, shrugging, a glint in her eye hinting at more deliberate intent. Guests at her private gatherings increased. Advisors, journalists, political figures, many who had little business in Buckingham Palace. The Queen was clearly consolidating power, expanding influence quietly, strategically. Yet to outsiders, the polish, the poise, and the perfect smile made it all seem like elegance. Her presence commanded attention, leaving those who watched from the shadows aware that the balance of power within the palace had begun to shift. Those who had attended her private gatherings noticed the guest list growing longer, advisors, journalists, political figures, many of whom had little business being at Buckingham Palace in the first place. When asked about it, Camilla brushed it off as just good networking. The palace staff, ever attuned to the shifting winds of power, began to adapt immediately. Some aides quietly aligned themselves with Camilla's circle, seeing in her a figure who might soon wield greater authority. Others kept their distance, wary of being caught on the wrong side of the rising influence. If the balance tipped, she played the long game. One former staff member would later say, shaking his head, "Charles doesn't even see the board." It was not said with malice, but with the weary resignation of someone who had witnessed too many palace games to be surprised by another. Still, the king could not shake the growing unease gnawing at him. It was not only the whispered remarks or the flattering press coverage, it was a feeling deep in his bones that something was shifting beneath his feet at night. He would walk the long corridors alone, the portraits of his ancestors watching from the walls, silent witnesses to centuries of intrigue. He thought of the history, of monarchs who had faced rebellions, betrayals, and power struggles of their own. He wondered if they would have seen what was happening now. Would they have acted sooner? And he wondered, most painfully, if he had been blind for too long in the days that followed. The tension thickened like fog. Conversations went hushed when the king entered a room. Certain courtiers began meeting behind closed doors with Camilla, emerging with tight-lipped smiles that told more than words ever could. The king's schedule suddenly filled with engagements that kept him away from the palace for hours at a time. Appointments that some suspected were carefully arranged. Without his full consent, she was creating a vacuum. One of his loyal aides warned, "The moment you step out of it, she's stepping in." Camilla, meanwhile, appeared entirely untroubled by the shifting dynamics. If anything, she seemed energized at public appearances. She spoke with confidence, sometimes fielding questions meant for the king. In interviews, she would praise his service, but always with a faintly patronizing edge, as though speaking of someone whose best years were behind him, someone whose heart remained good, yet vulnerable. She told one reporter, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, "Sometimes a steady hand is needed on the wheel." The remark made headlines the next morning, and though couched as affection, its undertone was unmistakable. The king's most trusted confidants tried to rally him, urging him to assert his authority before it was too late. But Charles, ever cautious, hesitated. To act too aggressively might fuel the very rumours he wished to quash, while doing nothing could allow them to grow unchecked. The palace had entered dangerous territory, a realm where perception could be as powerful as truth. And in that realm, Camilla was proving herself to be a master player behind the walls of Buckingham Palace. The game had begun in earnest. Every smile, every public remark, every carefully placed story in the press was another move in a match. Only a few could see the board in full. The king sensed it. Now, even if he had not at first, this was no ordinary strain in a royal marriage. This was something calculated, deliberate, something that, if left unanswered, could change the very shape of the monarchy. And as the corridors whispered and the headlines mounted, one question hung unspoken in the air: how long before the game stopped being played in shadows and erupted into the light? The breaking point began with something as small and unassuming as a folded sheet of paper. King Charles had been reviewing his morning correspondence in his private study, sifting through the usual mix of official documents, handwritten notes from well-wishers, and briefing papers stacked beneath a pile of invitations. A letter lay on top, sealed in cream-coloured stationery bearing a crest. He recognised a high-ranking political ally whose loyalty had always seemed unquestionable. Curiosity drew him to open it. As his eyes scanned the neatly typed paragraphs, the words seemed to twist and darken before him. It spoke of future leadership, of ensuring stability for the monarchy, and of transition plans that must remain discreet. What struck him most were the lines in Camilla's own hand, scrawled in the margin. "The crown must be in capable hands. I am ready when the time comes." Charles read those words again and again, heart pounding. The meaning was unmistakable. For a long moment, he sat frozen, chair creaking under him, paper trembling in his grip. Outside his window, the gardens were bathed in soft spring sunlight, a cruel contrast to the storm gathering inside him. This was not idle gossip or overheard rumour. This was written proof, in Camilla's own hand, of her willingness, her intention, to step into a role that was not hers. He thought back to every strange remark, every sidelong glance, every whispered conversation he had dismissed as palace chatter. Now, it all fit together like pieces of a puzzle he wished he had never solved. Only hours later, as if the letter alone were not enough, the second blow landed. One of his senior aides entered his study with a look so grave that Charles knew, before a word was spoken, that it was bad news. "Your Majesty," the aide said quietly, "you need to hear this for yourself." From a small recorder came the unmistakable voice of Queen Camilla, her tone calm, almost conversational as she spoke to an unknown confidant. "His health is not what it once was. The strain is showing. Someone has to think of the monarchy's future, and if I must take charge for the good of the institution, then so be it." There was no malice in her voice, only certainty, the kind that carried the weight of intent. Charles listened to the recording twice, then a third time, each repetition stoking the fire in his chest. It was not simply what she said, but the ease with which she said it, as though supplanting him was not treachery, but duty. He thought of the years they had spent together, the public battles fought to defend their marriage, the careful construction of their shared image. Now, with a few sentences, She had revealed her willingness to undo it all for the good of the monarchy. The words burned like acid. When the aide left, closing the heavy wooden door behind him, Charles rose from his chair. He moved to the sideboard where a crystal decanter of brandy waited. Pouring himself a glass with unsteady hands, he stared at the amber liquid, then set it down untouched. His reflection in the darkened window looked older, more tired than he had ever noticed. Rage came swiftly, unbidden. He swept the glass from the sideboard, sending it shattering across the floor. The sharp crack of crystal echoed through the study, followed by the ragged sound of his own breathing. "After everything," he muttered under his breath, gripping the edge of his desk as though it were the only thing keeping him upright. It was not long before he summoned those he trusted most. His son William arrived first, concern deepening as soon as he saw the state of the study, the broken glass, scattered papers, thick air of unspoken anger. "Father," he began cautiously, "what's happened?" Charles handed him the letter without a word. William read slowly, jaw tightening with each line. Then Charles played the recording. When it ended, the room was silent, except for the faint hum of the recorder winding down. "Your stepmother," William said, eyes dark. Charles finally spoke, voice low but cutting. "She would crown herself if she could." Not long after, Princess Anne joined them, her entrance brisk, eyes sharp as they scanned her brother's face. "You look as though you've been at war," she said, closing the door behind her. "Perhaps I have," Charles replied bitterly, sliding the letter across the desk. Anne read it with stoic composure, but the slight narrowing of her eyes betrayed her fury. "This is no accident," she said last. "Letters like this aren't misplaced. They're meant to be found, or they're meant to be kept hidden forever. Either way, it tells us exactly where she stands." The three of them spoke in hushed but urgent tones, the gravity of the moment sinking in. "We cannot act rashly," William cautioned, though his clenched fist suggested he was as angry as his father. Anne, however, was less inclined toward restraint. "You've been too careful for too long, Charles. This," she tapped the letter with one finger, "is not something we can ignore. You must decide now whether you will confront her or whether you'll let her continue until there's nothing left to defend." Charles listened, his gaze fixed on the fire crackling in the hearth. He felt as though the very walls of the palace were pressing in on him, carrying the weight of centuries of royal conflict like an invisible, suffocating shroud. He thought of his mother, Queen Elizabeth, and the quiet strength she had wielded with unyielding grace. What would she have done in his place? Would she have waited, hoping for reconciliation, or acted decisively to protect the crown for the rest of that night? The king, his heir, and his sister remained in the study, their voices alternating between tense whispers and sharp bursts of frustration. The letter lay between them on the desk, the recording device beside it, a pair of silent witnesses to looming betrayal. Charles knew that when the sun rose, the decisions made in these hours would set the course for everything that followed. But as the fire burned low and the palace beyond, the study sank into a profound silence. One truth settled heavily over him. Whatever love or trust had once lived between him and Camilla had been replaced by something else entirely. And once replaced, he suspected it could never be restored. The royal confrontation left the palace steeped in shadows that night, the kind of deep, restless darkness that seemed to press down, tangible, almost suffocating. Outside, rain lashed against the tall windows of Buckingham Palace, its rhythmic pounding a steady, relentless drumbeat echoing the storm brewing inside him. The corridors were silent, the usual hum of staff activity long gone, leaving only the distant toll of the clock marking each passing second in his private quarters. King Charles stood by the window, staring out at the glistening courtyard below. The flickering light of the fireplace cast his face in sharp relief, deepening the lines of age, carved further by the burden of what he had discovered tonight. Tonight, the truth, however ugly, would not remain hidden. It would be laid bare. Camilla entered the room with the air of someone entirely unaware, her emerald dressing gown swaying gently as she crossed the floor. "You wanted to see me?" she asked, voice steady, though her eyes flicked briefly toward his rigid stance. Charles didn't move from the window for a long moment. He simply watched the rain streak down the glass, each drop a silent drumbeat of foreboding. Then he turned, voice low but edged with steel. "How long have you been planning this?" She froze. "Planning what?" he pressed, stepping closer, gaze unyielding. "Was it all a plan from the start? You used people to get what you wanted. Is that why you divorced Andrew Parker Bowles, because he no longer had worth to you?" His voice rose with anger, breaking through restraint. "Once you're done with them, you abandon or turn against them, just as you are doing to me right now." Camilla's lips parted in disbelief, perhaps indignation. "That's absurd," she said quickly, a scoff escaping her. "You're twisting." But Charles cut her off sharply. "Do not lie to me. Not tonight, not after I've seen the letters, not after I've heard the recordings." His tone was no longer just accusatory. It was wounded, heavy with betrayal. "I brought you in, Camilla. I fought the whole world to be with you. And you—" He stopped, swallowing hard as his voice faltered. "I never imagined the woman I fought for would be the one to bring me down." Her eyes hardened. Then a flash of something dangerous replaced the initial shock. "And what would you have me do?" she said sharply. "Stand by while you let this institution crumble? Watch you dither and hesitate while the world questions your every decision?" Charles stared at her, chest rising and falling with barely contained rage. "Weak leadership," he repeated, almost in disbelief. "Is that your justification? Is that the excuse you tell yourself when you plot to take my place?" She stepped closer, voice dropping but cutting deep. "If you can't rule, someone must, and I won't let this family collapse because you're too afraid to act." The fire crackled in the silence that followed, its warmth failing to soften the cold that had settled between them. In her tone, Charles felt the weight of her words settle on him like lead. For a brief, shattering moment, his mind flooded with the past. Every sacrifice he had made, every person he had pushed aside, he saw the faces of those he had betrayed to secure this life with her. And most of all, he saw Diana, who had stood by him through humiliation and scrutiny. Diana, who would never have sought to take the crown from his head. She would have fought beside him until the very end, not positioned herself to replace him. "What have I done?" he whispered to himself, voice breaking under the weight of realization. "I betrayed her for this." His eyes met Camilla's again, filled not only with anger, but with hollow grief. "You were supposed to be my ally, my partner." He trailed off, shaking his head as if the words were too bitter to speak. The air between them grew heavier, the silence more volatile. Then the dam broke. The argument erupted in full force, shouts ricocheting off gilded walls, accusations thrown like daggers. Camilla denied, then countered, her voice rising to match his. Charles accused, mourned, and raged, the pitch of his anger at times giving way to raw hurt. Ava, an heirloom gifted by a foreign monarch decades ago, was swept from the mantel and smashed to pieces on the marble floor. The sound was sharp, violent, final. Neither flinched. Camilla's face flushed, her hands clenched at her sides. "You think this is betrayal?" she demanded. "This is survival, Charles. If you can't see that, then perhaps you are the one who's lost your way." The words struck him like a slap, leaving him momentarily stunned, breath coming in short, unsteady bursts. He realized then that whatever they had once shared, whatever love or loyalty had bound them, was now fractured beyond repair. Camilla turned on her heel, the swish of her gown the only sound as she strode toward the door. She paused, hand on the handle, looking back, not with sorrow, but with something closer to cold certainty. "If you can't rule," she repeated, icy. "Someone must." Then she was gone. The door closed behind her with a soft but resounding finality. Charles remained where he stood, rain still battering the windows, fire still crackling in the hearth, yet the room felt colder, emptier than moments before. His gaze fell to the shattered remains of the vase at his feet, the shards scattered like the fragments of his trust. Somewhere deep down, he knew this night marked the point of no return. Whatever path lay ahead, it would not be walked together, and in that truth, there was no comfort, only the echo of a storm that had finally broken. The palace had weathered scandals before, but never like this. In the days following the confrontation, a silent war began to take shape. Within its ancient walls, the air seemed heavier. Greetings between staff members grew shorter, more cautious. Behind closed doors, courtiers whispered and speculated, their loyalties quietly shifting. Some believed Charles still held the wisdom and steadiness needed to guide the monarchy. Others, however, were convinced Camilla's decisiveness made her the stronger leader. In the hushed corners of the private corridors, an older aide murmured to a colleague, "If it comes to survival, I'd put my bet on her. She plays for keeps." These divisions were not spoken aloud in official meetings, but they coloured every exchange, every glance. The split among staff did not remain a palace secret for long. Within days, leaks began trickling to the press, and soon the media was awash with headlines about marital tensions and palace power struggles. Tabloids printed stories with unnamed insiders hinting at heated arguments, separate living quarters, and rival camps forming around the king and queen. One headline blared, "Buckingham's silent civil war," while another declared, "Is Camilla ready to rule?" The press feasted on every rumour, whether true or invented. It was a gold rush for them. One exasperated courtier said privately, "The palace might as well be shoveling out the dirt for them." Beyond the palace gates, the public reaction was fierce and deeply divided. Social media lit up with debates, hashtags multiplying overnight. Hashtag Team Charles trended first, filled with messages of sympathy for a king many saw as betrayed. But it wasn't long before hashtag Team Camilla rose to rival it, supporters praising her strength and modern leadership. Royal commentators filled television panels, arguing over who truly embodied the future of the monarchy. It was a battle of perception. One pundit remarked on air, "Perception in this game can be more powerful than truth." Some even likened the unfolding events to the great royal crises of the past, stirring memories of abdication, divorces, and scandals that once shook the crown to its core. Inside Buckingham Palace, Charles could feel the isolation closing in like a tightening vice in private meetings. Some of his own advisers began suggesting, ever so carefully, that it might be wise to allow Camilla to take on more duties in the interest of stability. The implication was clear. She was becoming the face of the monarchy, whether he sanctioned it or not. Charles would sit at the head of the table, listening in silence, hands folded tightly together. Once he asked pointedly, "And where does that leave me?" The room fell quiet, the question hanging in the air like smoke, curling and lingering as if no one dared to answer. No one did. One afternoon, as he walked the long gallery lined with portraits of kings and queens, he paused before the likeness of Edward VIII. The painted eyes seemed almost alive, full of charm and defiance, a silent reminder of the monarch who had surrendered the throne in a storm of controversy. A voice broke the silence behind him. It was a palace official speaking in a low tone. "The last time the monarchy faced this much internal warfare," he said gravely, "it ended in abdication." The words struck Charles like a cold wind. He turned to face the man, but no further explanation came. It didn't need to. The weight of history and the unspoken warning settled into his bones. That night, the king sat alone in his study, the rain tapping against the windows, much like it had on the night of the confrontation. The fires of anger had cooled into something colder, heavier, a sense of siege, of walls closing in. He knew the battle was no longer confined to the private spaces of the palace. It had spilled into the public arena, where opinion could sway the destiny of the crown itself. The corridors he once walked with ease now felt like battlegrounds, every smile concealing allegiance, every silence holding judgment. Though the walls of Buckingham had stood for centuries, Charles could not shake the growing fear that they might not withstand this war from within. The final blow waiting just beyond the marble floors and gilded ceilings. The rain had not stopped for days, and it seemed to Charles as though the heavens themselves were foreshadowing the storm he was about to unleash. In the stillness of his private study, he gathered with his most trusted legal advisers, men and women whose discretion was as valuable as their expertise. Thick folders lay on the polished oak table, each holding centuries-old precedents and modern constitutional interpretations. Charles's voice was steady, but there was an iron weight behind it. "I need to know," he said, "how the law allows a monarch to strip a queen of her role without dismantling the monarchy itself." Pens scratched against paper. Legal minds moved through the labyrinth of royal protocols. One older advisor, grave-faced, finally cautioned, "It can be done, Your Majesty, but it will leave a scar that the public will see." For decades, Charles's reply was quiet but unyielding. "Then it must be a scar we learn to live with." Not long after, Charles made his way to a dimly lit chamber within Buckingham Palace, where the Archbishop of Canterbury awaited him. The air was heavy with incense, the flicker of candlelight casting long shadows across the ancient stone walls. Charles approached slowly, his steps echoing on the marble floor. When he finally spoke, his words trembled not with fear, but with the enormity of the decision he was making. "How do you remove a queen without tearing the crown in two?" The Archbishop studied him for a long moment, then replied in a tone both pastoral and unflinchingly direct. "There is no path through this that will leave you untouched, but if the heart of the monarchy is to survive, sometimes it must endure surgery, no matter how deep the cut." Charles closed his eyes briefly, absorbing the weight of that truth, and knew there was no turning back. While Charles moved with calculated precision, Camilla was far from idle. Word of the king's consultations had reached her through loyal aides, and she acted swiftly, rallying her supporters in private salons and gatherings. Advisors, courtiers, and influential allies who still believed in her vision for the monarchy aligned themselves with her. "He is making a mistake," she told them, voice sharper than ever. "He forgets who stood beside him when the world despised him. He forgets who kept this family from collapsing under its own weakness. I will not go quietly, and I will not allow his hesitation to ruin us all." She appeared defiant, commanding to others desperate, but it was clear she was making one final push to secure her place. The day of the announcement arrived with tension that could be felt in every corner of the palace. Charles dressed in a dark suit that seemed to swallow the light. He stepped before the cameras, expression grave, lines on his face deeper than just weeks before. Millions across the country and around the world tuned in, air thick with anticipation. In a voice firm enough to cut through the static of doubt, Charles declared, "Loyalty to the crown must come before personal ambition. It is with deep regret, but with absolute necessity, that I announce the Queen Consort will be stepping back from royal duties indefinitely." He paused, letting the words sink in, knowing they would ignite both fury and relief. "This decision," he continued, "is made in the interest of the stability and unity of the monarchy, which must always stand above the desires of any individual, including myself." When the cameras clicked off, the silence in the room was almost suffocating. Outside, the rain finally began to ease, but the storm inside Buckingham Palace was only beginning. The corridors buzzed with whispered speculation. The press roared with headlines. The nation divided once more. But Charles knew he had crossed the final threshold. The blow had been struck, and nothing, not history, not love, not traditions, could reverse it. The crown had demanded its price, and he had paid it. But what fate awaits Camilla? And do you think she will accept it? The Queen in exile. Camilla's silent war. Camilla's departure from Buckingham Palace was not announced with fanfare, nor marked by the formalities of state. It was a quiet, almost surgical extraction. A single black car carried her away through the palace gates, its tinted windows hiding a face neither defeated nor broken, but calculating. She retreated to her private estate in the countryside, where the grand halls were silent, save for the echo of her own footsteps. Refusing every interview request that came her way, she spoke only to a tight circle of friends, yet when she did, her words carried the sharpness of a blade cloaked in velvet. "I may be gone from the palace," she confided to one such friend over a late-night glass of wine, "but the game is far from over." Those who knew her best understood. Camilla never surrendered without a strategy. She began sketching notes, making calls, and keeping her advisors ready. Every move carefully plotted, every alliance quietly reinforced. Back in London, Charles stood at the centre of a storm of divided opinion. To some, his decision marked him as a strong and decisive monarch, willing to put the stability of the crown above personal affection. "He has done what needed to be done," said one senior courtier, speaking under anonymity. Yet to others, Charles revealed a darker streak. Whispers painted him as vindictive, a man unable to tolerate a rival, even one who shared his bed for decades. "He cut her out like a tumour," murmured one political commentator on a late-night broadcast. But perhaps the disease was never hers to begin with. Charles ignored it publicly, but in private chambers he felt the weight of each word like stones pressing on his chest. The fracture spread into the family itself, a fault line that could not be smoothed over with palace statements or polite dinners. William, ever dutiful, offered his father a cool, professional brand of support. "You did what you believed was right," he said, tone measured, warmth notably absent. It was Harry's reaction, however, that stirred the greatest shock. From his distant life abroad, the Duke of Sussex made an unexpected call. "I never thought I'd say this," his voice slow and deliberate, "but maybe this time you and I are on the same side." Charles, taken aback, said nothing for several long seconds, unsure if this was a bridge rebuilt or merely a temporary ceasefire in their long-standing Cold War. As the weeks passed, the surface of the monarchy seemed smooth once more. Public appearances resumed. Ceremonial duties continued. The great machine of the crown moved forward as though nothing had happened. Yet within the inner corridors of power, subtle, unmistakable tremors persisted. Advisors whispered of mysterious meetings between Camilla's old allies and influential figures outside the palace walls. Anonymous leaks hinted at documents, conversations, and alliances that could yet change the game. Charles felt it too. The uneasy prickle between his shoulder blades, the warning that the battle was far from finished. And in the countryside, far from the gilded halls of Buckingham, Camilla walked the manicured gardens of her estate with a calm almost unnerving. She fed the birds, drank tea from fine china, entertained select visitors in softly candlelit drawing rooms. But behind every measured smile, every polite farewell, a plan was being drawn. She knew the palace better than most, its weaknesses, its fractures, its pressure points. Her exile, she believed, was not an end. It was merely the quiet before the next move. And as one friend whispered after leaving her company, "If anyone thinks she's done, they've already lost." The palace settled into its usual evening hush. When the first tremor of unease returned to a senior courtier's private office, a sealed envelope appeared without fanfare, placed neatly by an unseen hand. The handwriting was elegant, deliberate, almost regal. Inside was a single sheet of thick cream paper bearing a short message. "The queen you cast aside will be the one to bring you down." No signature, only the faint scent of Camilla's favoured perfume lingering in the folds. The courtier hesitated, debating whether to take it to Charles or destroy it. Some instinct whispered, this was only the beginning. That same night, Charles sat alone in his study, fire crackling, rain relentless outside. Weary, though never admitting it aloud, an aide entered silently, delivering another envelope. Anonymous, slipped through unknown channels. The message was identical to the one received by the courtier, written in a different hand as if to ensure authenticity. Charles read it once, then again, fingers tightening around the page. "So it begins," he muttered under his breath, though to whom he was speaking, himself, Camilla, or the crown, remained unclear. He moved to the great window overlooking the palace gardens, the reflection of his face staring back through the glass beyond the stone walls. London stretched into the night, unaware of the private war rekindling in its royal heart. The crown felt heavier than ever, not from the weight of gold, but from the knowledge that enemies could hide behind the same velvet curtains that once protected him. Somewhere out there, Camilla waited patient as a shadow. If you enjoyed this royal saga, don't forget to like, subscribe, share, and drop a comment below with your thoughts. The palace drama is far from over.